Yeah, hi all. Good evening. So today we'll be covering best practices for Salesforce development. So this is me, Ankit Jain. So I'm a technical architect at MNC. So I'm 18x certified. So I've been active in Salesforce events. Also, I have a WhatsApp group where I share the technical means articles which are relevant to Salesforce development, the best practices, and some job openings which I see randomly on the LinkedIn. So this is my short intro. So let's go ahead with the agenda that I have. Like, we'll go through the importance of best practices. We'll go through the best practices, the practical examples, and the conclusion. So, first, the very first question that means anyone should ask me is like, what is the harm that I don't learn best practices? Why should I even care? You would also you should have that question, Kusum, I guess.
Yeah,
So, the only reason I care about this is because if I know these, so whenever any issue comes up, when the application is becoming too much big or there are any changes that comes up to me, it is very easy for me to make the changes, which in terms, if we try to talk in the technical terms, it leads to is translated to the improving the code quality, enhancing the maintainability and optimizing performance and ensuring that it is scalable. These are only reason that I learn about that. Otherwise, there's no need for these best practices and all of those.
yes,
So in Apex code, like these are the best practices that we have. Like first is around the bulkification. Then where we need to avoid the SQL and DML inside the loop. And then also in the SQL, we have to avoid the means optimize the SQL queries. Don't means I will go over each of those points in more detail in further slides. Now I'm just reading it out. So SQL optimizing SQL queries. So basically, what happens is like sometimes like the queries take too much time. Like in the production environment, you have millions of records. So
yeah,
SQL queries are bound to timeout. So what you can do is first, never apply not equal to null in any of those SQL queries. Second, never ever use any formula field in your where clause. Always use indexed field. Like instead of sorting it by created date, you can use the system mod stamp, or wherever you're possible, like in the comparison, use the look indexed field, like all the lookup fields that we have, or any standard indexed field, like system mod stamp is a standard indexed field. So use those. Next is the using of map of S objects. So basically, you need to know how to play with all those collections like map, set, and list. And another underestimates means not widely used math class is limits class. Limits class basically Salesforce is provided for a very important reason. Limits class tells you like how much limit is being consumed and what is the limits of your org. So you know like how much limit is left. Next is around avoiding the hard coding of IDs. We all know like be it the simplest thing which you know won't change for you, but for scalability, like whenever have seen even today when I review the code of the team that I handle, their hard coded IDs are therein. The only reason they say is like they're utilizing lightning email templates. They say like the developer name itself is dynamic in that regard. So what can we do? So to for such scenarios as well, you use the name field or any other field which should remain constant across your multiple environments. The only reason you avoid hard-coded IDs, hard-coding of IDs is like whenever you might do the migration from one environment to another one, or if you're doing an app exchange development, you install it in the client's org. So those things should not change. And if you hard-code those, then you won't be able to make those changes in. So that's why you should avoid the hard-coding of IDs. Next is around database methods while doing DML operation. See, the database class is very important because of two reasons. First, you get the option of making it like all of or none as the second parameter. Third part, second part is for some scenarios, like you want to have a duplicate rule, but you want that for a specific source, like when a specific it when it is through the data is being inserted through the API, you want to bypass that. So using DML options, you can actually handle those kind of scenarios. So with the regular insert method or update method, you won't be able to do those things. But with your database methods, the database.insert or database.update, you're able to do those things. Next is around exception handling. We all are familiar with try and catch. Give me just 1 second. Give me 1 second.
Okay. Take time.
Yeah. अरे मेरे भाई अभी सेशन चल रहा है मेरा में बाबू. Yeah, I'm back. So, okay. Yeah. So what I was saying is we we were on this one. Which screen are you currently seeing?
Yes, yes.
No, which screen?
No, with
On
this
this.
best practice of X code.
Okay, yeah. So I was talking about exception handling in. So we all know are familiar with try and catch block. But let's accept that there are few scenarios where the exception is not even with their catch. There are some exceptions which are unhandled exceptions. For those scenarios, your try and catch won't work out. Means even if they, sorry, try catch will work out, but you won't be able to capture the logs. With such scenarios, you will have to have a exception handling, means log handler, or I will call it like error logging framework in place. So what would should happen is for exceptions when it is coming in, you fire a platform event. And even and as we know, like a platform event is a fire and forget. So it would continue to work, and based on that firing of that event, you would be able to capture the logs. We will cover that exception handling in further session, but just to give you a high level idea, like that's why it covered talk about it in the best practices. Next is the use of transactional finalizers. So finalizers, I believe most of you won't be familiar with that. So finalizers are like a special interface that Salesforce introduced, which is applicable to queuable. Like when you want to know when a queuable class that you have written is executed, so you use transactional finalizers for that. So through that, it would help you to do the exception handling, have the retry mechanism, and all of those. Next is one trigger per object per event. So basically, we all know like we should have only one trigger per object. Also, one part which is not mentioned here, but I assumed like I will just cover since the list was becoming too long. So what I should say is like your trigger should be logicless. None of your code should, if else condition should be in the trigger. Everything should be handled in your trigger handler class. The reason being the solid principles like segregation of, I mean, separation of concern. Like trigger is import class is only written so that you are able to capture those different events. It's the trigger handler's job to do the specific business operation in all of those. Next is use asynchronous epics. See, many times we think like everything should happen in one go, but for few scenarios, like the actual side effect that from the user experience endpoint, if an operation is taking too much time, instead of waking and that operation is background, not directly impacting the user's uh, interaction, we can make that process asynchronous. There are two advantages of that. First, you get more governor limits with making it asynchronous. Second, the user means the user is able to get the response in less time. The next best practice that we have is around security and sharing in Apex code. See, Salesforce has given us three keywords, means with sharing, without sharing, and inherited sharing or default sharing, I would say. So we should use those things like with sharing. What it would do is whatever records that you don't own, and means when you write that class and you do a query, it would check like if the records that are being queried, what do you have access of those records through some or the other mechanism. It can be like either you are an owner, either you have the access through the teams through territory assignment rules, or through Apex managed Apex sharing, or through the OWD. So based on those things, you have to it would work. So use that in your code, like mention it like it whether it should be run without sharing or with sharing, or it should run as default. Next is make reusability of Apex code. So this comes down to again the solid principles where it's recommended to have the common code in your domain class so that that method can be called from multiple places. So that's why you should write a code so that it can be reused across multiple scenarios. In my practical project, like I had a requirement where I had to write an Apex REST service so that the website can show the different set of stores. Later, they told me that apart from that, providing that REST service, they want a custom component in your Salesforce itself to have the same functionality. Now, because I had followed the proper design pattern, I didn't had to write much logic. What the effort that I consumed was just for that LWC component. So this way you have to write the code so that you avoid the time consumption and have the code that is very easy to maintain and scalable. The next point is around code coverage. Very important, yet least cared about developers, most of them. So whenever you have the code, like try to make it the code in such a way that less number of lines are needed in. Wherever you think like you're repeating the same lines, try to make a common method. And in turn, what it would help you is like in your test classes, since it would be like the lesser the code, the less would be the effort for the test classes. So that's the reason we have it. Next is return early pattern. Basically, what normally we do is like we let the if suppose the pattern is not fulfilling, we let the code execute the later number of lines as well instead of returning that directly. So that is called return early pattern. In further slides, I will try to show it visually as well so that it can be better understood. Next is avoiding nested loops within loops. Basically, it comes down to the time complexity. If it is a single loop, the complexity is omega of n. And if it becomes nested loops, two loops, then it becomes omega of omega square. So that's why you try to reduce the number of inner loops. Instead of a single loop, multiple places. So the complexity remains less. The next thing you had any question, Kusum?
It's in your last line, can you repeat this omega?
Omega is actually see complexity of any code is measured in two terms. One is the time complexity and second is space complexity. Time complexity is the time taken to
Yeah.
execute a piece of code.
Yes.
So in that we measure it like if it is a single loop means there would be like say x seconds that would be it would be taking it to take the time. Since we can't measure the exact time, so we measure it like a function, mathematical function like omega of n, and then it is like omega of n square.
Yeah. Okay, I got it.
Next is don't mix Apex, process builder, workflow rules, and triggered flows. So the nutshell is like don't have multiple automations on the same object through multiple mechanisms. If you're
Yeah.
writing a trigger, stick to that. If you're using flows, stick to that. The more automations you write in an object, the more chances are like you would get timeout kind of errors. And record locking will also increase if not the code is not written in the proper way. Next is Apex naming convention. This I think every tech lead or every architect had struggled with the naming convention, providing it a common across everywhere. So what Salesforce has done is like they have prepared a document out of it in Quip, which can be reused. So that link is there, and so I will just open that and show like how it actually needs to happen. Next is like code review checklist and code review process. See, the above things are should be taken care. That's true, and people might be following it as well. But there should be a formal process of code review where it would kind of measure if the number of lines like the code is not written the proper way. Like there are like say what 120 the line is going above 120 characters, or it is like there are means the same there are multiple places like where the variables which are not at all means which are declared are not no longer used, or if you can the other scenarios could be like the logic that would has been implemented is very inefficient and could be improved. So to avoid all those things, code review process should be in place. Next is Apex performance. So basically, your for few of the scenarios, like taking example of say in trigger, you have the trigger dot new map and trigger dot old map. So what should be done is you could wherever you need the map instead of creating it for loop, you can directly reuse those trigger variables in. So that way, their performance would increase and overall the time for the execution. Any questions so far?
No, sir.
Yeah. Next is we talked about the bulkification of any code. So what bulkification actually means is like whenever the number of records are too much large, we should our code should be able to handle. And why it really matters because Salesforce being a cloud environment, like it would process the data in bulk. And what it could happen if the code is not bulkified, you would be hitting governor limits. You might your queries might get timed out. Your performance would decrease.
Uh,
So to avoid all of those things, bulkification should be done. For bulkification, now your next question should be how can I bulkify? So the simple rule is like you can use collections of list, set, and map. And there's a misconception like in flows, bulkification does not happen. In flows as well, bulkification happens. Whenever you call an Apex method, it would your Apex method should will still have the parameters as list, and it would be executed as a single bulk operation. So don't consider it like if it is not if it is a flow, the code is not bulkified and you can just go get away with it. So Many people I have seen have that misconception. So that I want to just clear that out. And the other is like around the querying, doing the query and DML outside loops. See, even today, I see many people doing a query inside the loop, which is not a good practice. Instead, use an in query. Instead of querying the record in a loop, you just use one in query and get the records at once instead of querying the data multiple times. While you do that, what you would do is, I mean, what you're also handling is like the number of limits that the Salesforce imposed, like our regular governor limits. Those governor limits would be automatically taken care of if your code is bulkified.
Yes.
If the records is large, you can also go with like this kind of syntax, or how I have written. Like you can use the query as the square bracket in the for each this way as well. What this would help you is like this can help you avoid the heap size because internally it would be doing the chunking for you. It would break the large number of records into small chunks and then perform the operation. So this is around bulkification. Next we go about is the transitional finalizers. As I mentioned, like this is you are able to attach this finalizers to queuable. So system finalizer is the interface name. So instead of polling, you can directly get a kind of a final state. Like in Java, you have like a finally keyword. So it's kind of finally for your queuable class. And another thing is, it's like you can, if you want to have a kind of a count, like in batch class, you want to know how many records are processed or which are successful or unsuccessful. So you would be able to do that since you know like these things are already done. So that's about transition finalize. So please, wherever you're utilizing queuable, handle these transitional finalizers. Means implement this finalizer interface. Next is around the hard coding, which I explained earlier. Don't hard code anything ever. Wherever you think like the things are all dependent, you can use custom setting, but it doesn't mean each and everything you put it as a custom setting and say like it would be handled later, or means doing the deployment through custom settings. Always, wherever possible, use the developer name to query or any fixed ID thing which would be same across all the environments. If any specific configuration, like suppose your Orbit email address that could vary based on the environment. Like for UAT, the client might give you some other Orbit email address. For production, it would be different. So those things you can keep in custom setting, but not any specific hard-coded ID.
Yes.
Now let's talk about flows. What I have seen so far is like people just create flows. They don't think like whether what it would do, whether you would need to kind of it would be feasible with flow or not. What kind of flow would actually you would be needing in? Can that functionality be done in before flow or it would need after flow? They just get started without thinking. And also in flows, I've seen like people have doing tables inside the loop. Next is and use advanced technique to merge decision node. Sometimes what happens is like people tend to increase the number of nodes, but don't think it like sometimes the conditions can be, though flows can be quite simplified, but people don't think in that and let it have the long process. Next is create reusable flow, that is subflow, or I will call it autonomous flow as well. So what happens is like the more it's brings down again everything is if you go in deep, everything comes down to solid principles. Like if the subflow is for specific functionality, it has a single responsibility. So you can get to that functionality independently developed without altering the regular record triggered flow. So use reusable flows or subflows. Next is don't create flow for everything. Like see, sometimes there are some other options apart from creating flow. Like suppose you want to default a value, you have that option in your field itself or in the record type configuration itself. You don't have to create a before float for doing that and overkilling it. Next is don't create a flow inside a test or a sandbox environment. Means always do it your regular development and then migrate it to higher environments. Next is invocable epics. See, some always use a combination of flows plus epics. Like any DML operation is needed in, you can always use epics. The advantage you have is like it's bulkified. Give me 1 second. Yeah, sorry for disturbance.
Okay, it's okay, sir.
Um, didn't knew like I was on this one invocable apex. So invocable apex basically with apex you can bulkify the code. Otherwise, the regular DML that you have in flows would be consumed. It is not bulkified. Next is again hard coding of IDs. It's common for both Apex and flows. Next is again the same, like we don't have multiple automations on the same. And like you can now handle means create have the custom errors in the flows itself, and you can do the handling with the fault path. Use that. Also, as I was talking about the exception handling, you can use the platform events. You can fire a platform event, and on that platform event, you can have your error logs captured. You can also create debug logs to figure out the error. Documenting you means whatever flows that you have on a particular object, you can document that. Although with the latest release means in recent releases, there's an option of Flow Explorer that Salesforce is providing, which helps you group those ones, but have that documented in your TDD. Next is around the flow naming conventions. See, naming convention is the only reason we do that is like in future, if anybody needs to figure out like where the change needs to happen, automatically is able to find out that much that quickly. So naming convention is quite important. The next item we have is like screen flow UI design tips. So your UI, whatever you do with means in your screen flows, you need to have the proper structuring of those screens that you have. Otherwise, this could be problematic. Next is this is float as this is actually very much like many people I have seen like are not familiar. Like Flow has the ability to create a test flows which you can use to validate your functionality. So in my team as well, there were few people who didn't know about it. People learned about it like the same way you write the Apex test class, the same reason you should be writing the test class for your tests for your flow as well. So now these are the whatever I talked about, you would find those things in multiple everywhere in the internet. But the points that are not covered in, I would like to talk about those things more. The first thing is like when you want to create a queue on an object, you won't be able to do that if any it is a master detail. So if it is a detail side of the object, you won't be able to create that. And always use a role of public group to add members to a queue. It's one of the best practices to do that. The only reason being like you want to avoid the people manually adding a people to a queue. Everything should be automatic. And for any dev project you're working with, any project, use prefix of that project when you are naming that. Next is around the creation of fields. So there are a few scenarios like which I have mentioned it here so that people kind of avoid those things. Next is around creating a new field. See, what normally people do is like directly just create a field. They don't do any checks. So what we should be doing in is like we should check if any same field exists, then reuse that. And if it means you can before using it, you can just highlight that so that the impact means if it's with the other team, you can just kind of discuss with them and reuse that. And the next thing, very important, is like at the field level, you would never want to prefix it with the project name because fields would be used across multiple projects, so it could be a problem there. And whatever the important part that I've noticed so far is like people give FLS to all the profiles and add it to all the profiles without knowing like whether it is needed or not. So we need to take care of those things as well as a part of the best practices. And also, like if a field is created, you have to validate like whether we need it on the list or not. For few scenarios, it won't be needed in. Same way, like on all some many fields on the payload are not at all needed. So we should take care of those. Same way, like which I talked about earlier, like related to creating a flow. So we need to, before creating a new flow, check like if any multiple record triggered flow is available on that object. The only reason being like I don't want multiple automation, multiple record triggered flows. My at least on different, at least and for different events, I want different. Uh, I want for same events, I wanted that only one automation should be there. Like suppose for before flow, I should want like on a particular audit say account, I have only one record triggered flow which is running in before. I don't want multiple before triggered flows. So this first step is to avoid that. And next step for that is I mentioned is create auto launch flow or subflow so that modularity can be maintained. Done. Next is around email alert. Whenever you create an email alert in your project, you need to check like if the letter email template already exists and always use letterheads. Be it any project, the recommendation would always to will be to have a letterhead with that. And in that email template, you can make it project specific. And always the emails that are fired are should be from an Orgot email address. Although technically it's not required, but otherwise what would happen? It would fire it with the current user's email address, which in most scenarios is not ideal. So we should have an Orgot email address for which the email should be sent. So we should, while creating an email, we should prefix it with the project name, populate the resource field, and then create the email template and select OWA for sending that email. Another part is like writing Apex code. Sometimes what is as a part of best practices, always we have been taught like just write an Apex class for that, but it's not true. First, analyze the requirement and see if that you can fulfill that requirement while using Lightning Data Service, or I would say now for that regards GraphQL as well, so that wherever you can avoid the effects, try to avoid it. If the Apex class is actually needed, in write that and prefix it to the project name so that you are able to identify your components. The next slide is around the non-bulkified code pitfalls. So, which we already discussed, like if you don't follow the best bulkified code, you would kind of hit the kernel limits and performance would degrade. Next scenario is around the creating the public group. Again, it boils down to the same what we talked about the queues. Use the roles of public groups wherever you want to add the people to group. Don't have the admin to add that single person individually. Next is around list views. Although list view creation is considered a very simple task, but people actually don't pay much attention to that. When you create a list view, don't add that list view for all the users. Check like what set of people should actually be seeing that. Create a public group for those set of users and make that available only for that set of people. Under ownership, let select all so that and let the OWD or your sharing set take care of the records that should be visible. So those are things I had. I would now stop my screen share for a minute. And at the code level, I would like to uh, talk about few things which I mentioned earlier. Give me 1 second. Mm, Return early. So let me just share my 1 second. Let me just share my screen like this. Suppose you have to just if the input is say null, then instead of processing that further, you just return it here itself. So this is the return early pattern where you kind of if the input is invalid, you just return that. So that's what I wanted to highlight earlier. Other than that, I think most of the things were like self-explanatory. So any questions so far?
I want this
Uh,
question. Avoiding hard coding. Hard coding. What do you mean by hard coding? Hard coding it means static. I can't
yeah,
use in static way.
no,
Just
what
using
what it
dynamic.
what it means is like suppose in a flow or in a code, your let me just give you an example of that as well. Give me 1 minute.
Okay.
Mhm. Let me just share my screen again. Like this, like you're querying that specific ID all the time instead of making it parameterized. Like you can pass this account ID as a parameter and do the query from using here instead of hard coding that for a specific reason. So this is like your fixed
Yeah.
doing a fixed this value.
Okay.
So even in flows like while you query that email template, you put that ID like user X something. So that is a hard code. You're making that value fixed, which
Yeah.
won't
Yeah.
change. So
Oh. Yeah. In this value, fetch on our org in account.
yes,
Like.
and whenever your
Okay.
environment changes, it would kind of not work out, or it would pick up the wrong records.
Yeah. Okay, sir. Got it.
Any other questions?
Mm, Just one more question. Uh,
Okay.
this is a best practice for a SQL query in a for loop.
In for loop, see, when you talk about,
Bulkifications I'm talking
yeah,
about.
yeah, yeah. So what should you ideally be doing in is like, if you're doing a query, let's say your query should be uh, kind of like this, like where you have like a list of IDs, you're using the in operator in the ID, so that multiple records like this ID, it would be bulkified. This is a bulkified query because you're using the ID like in operator where you will have a set of IDs. Instead of you querying it one by one, you would be just collecting the list of those account IDs and doing a query at once.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. Because it's a use in a variable.
Yes.
That's why. Okay. It's not a for loop.
Because there are like there's another way like which we sometimes is referred as for loop query is like this.
Yeah.
This is called a for loop query.
Yes, sir. So yes, got.
Okay.
I am saying this. If I use a query uh, in a for loop.
You mean like this? 1 minute.
Yeah. For making an instance.
Like here.
Yeah. Yes.
Okay. So the problem you would be encountering in is like first thing, if the number of records is like say one more than 150, then it would fail. Second is like the time that would be taken care would also increase.
It means time complexity is increased.
Yeah, obviously because here the this code would get executed on omega of n.
Yeah.
But if suppose you have just one query, then it's no omega n, even it's not an omega n. It might be in some n log n or some kind of that kind of complexity that would happen because you're just querying it once. You're querying it n times here.
So
So
I'm just saying in a for loop, if I
yeah, here
create
this
an
one, yeah,
instance, so
yeah,
it's
like
changed
this.
to I think.
No, here you are doing the difference you have is here it is queried inside the for loop.
Okay.
I'm talking about this query, inner query.
Yes.
This scenario you're talking about, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
1 minute. Let me just show you a very scenario. Mm, mm, yes. Now is it clear?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. Now what you were asking?
Um, I'm not getting. So, where is used in ACC one? How?
Sorry. This ACC
Because
one.
yeah.
Suppose ACC one. Why I am creating that variable?
Yeah.
I wanted to just give you an example. Like this is the for loop where we are
Yeah.
querying that records in once. So I wanted to demonstrate that. That's the only reason I created that.
Okay. In sorry, sir, I'm not getting it because the list of account is already have a. in
One
next 20.
minute, 1 minute. Let me just make it a little better so you are able to. Okay. Uh, Now, are you able to follow?
Okay.
Now you are able to understand this example.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, no, it's okay.
Okay. Actually, the same object I use so that it's easy for me to just copy paste. That's the only reason. Otherwise, this could be one of those bad examples of using the query inside a loop.
Okay. Okay,
So,
got it, sir.
got it? Okay.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
Sorry, I was speaking. I was saying like, yeah, you can surely watch it on YouTube.
yes, sir. Actually, I have joined a few minutes ago. That's why I'm not getting properly.
Not a
I will
problem.
watch later.
Yeah, sure.
But I understood inner for loop. We cannot write the query. It will become complexity, increase the complexity.
It would increase the complexity. Also, it would hit your if the data volume is increasing, your kernel limit would also hit.
Yes,
So,
yes.